are live. Welcome everybody to Lubbock Compact Live for Wednesday, December the 13th. This will actually be our second to last show of the year. I know everybody is devastated to hear this news, but we will be taking the last week of December off so everybody can just enjoy their time with family or their rest or whatever you choose to do around holiday times and the end of the year. So this show today will be our second to last one. We'll be here next week, and then that will be it for the year. So we're kind of excited to get a new year started once all of this is over, and we'll see where we're at then. But anyway, I am your host, Adam Hernandez, and here with my co-host, Josh Shankles. And we have a special guest with us today, Bryan Giemza, who is a professor, amongst other things. And he is here to talk about climate change denialism and disinformation. And so I think it's a good topic. It's a great topic. I know for some people, I don't really understand why, but for a lot of people, this is a hot topic, a very contentious topic. But hopefully we can get some folks to follow the science and the evidence and maybe clear up some disinformation this evening. And that's our hope anyway. So Josh, go ahead and kick us off.
Yeah, no, Bryan, thanks for being here for our penultimate show of the year. Like we said last year, it was nice to get Giemza's back to back. We know you, we've been associated, but why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself to the audience? Tell us a little bit about what you do at Texas Tech and your background, your areas of research. What got you here?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for inviting me, guys. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this time with you and your audience. I'll give you the 80s rap version, who I am, what I'm here to say. So I have an unusual academic background. I've worn a lot of hats. And one of those, I was trained in environmental law before I went back to get my PhD. And so I've done some work kind of both in the field. I actually paid my way through law school, basically doing forestry work and wetland restoration. And I found that was incredibly satisfying work. In some ways, maybe even more satisfying than the paper chase of law school, because we would take in Eastern North Carolina, for example, I was living on the East Coast, we would take, old fields and plug the ditches and revert them to flooded wetlands. And I always take the very long view of things. I get a lot of satisfaction in creating things that I might not actually live to see. So you can imagine, I got to do all kinds of wonderful things as a conservationist and in the area of wetland restoration and mitigation. We would plant these fields up in trees, and I would come back. What had once just been kind of a spent tobacco field would have fish jumping in it and trees coming up and just be teeming with life. But then as time went on, something happened that was a useful lesson in humility and the vanity of human wishes, where some of those sites really started to get hammered by climate change. It changed the hydrology, the quality of the interaction with the water and land, changed the salinity, as that work was, and it did help me pay my way through law school. Policy mattered a lot too, and it kind of gave me an early awareness of what was coming down the line, what was then, I think, a newish concern if we flash back 20 years. Newish in kind of the popular conception. I should add, though, that we've known about climate change. There's, in fact, one of the early scientists was a a woman in the 19th century who put together the pieces. So we've known about this phenomenon for the better part of 150 years, and it has kind of come and gone and had these different transformations in the way that people perceive it. In part because there's some pretty powerfully entrenched interests that have, among other things, taken the approach of disinformation and sort of divisive communication. So flash forward from my law school days, forestry days, 20 years ago to the present, I never put aside the torch that I was carrying for environmental work, and I always wanted to find ways to get my students involved. Here at Texas Tech, I've taught about, for example, my students actually helped to find an heirloom apple variety that was like missing for 100 years in this part of Texas. It turned up all the way in Washington State, by the way. But I actually taught them kind of like, okay, here's how you become an apple detective and find these old varieties. In doing that, I was passing along things that I had learned from a kind mentor. In any case, I realized, particularly in the run up to the 2020 elections, that really divisive communications and disinformation, sort of weaponized information, was really taking its toll on our national politics as well as our local politics. So as I work with incredibly talented colleagues like Catherine Hayhoe, who is not just a favorite colleague of mine, just one of my favorite people, full stop, that I've ever met. When I met her, I said, what can I do to support her work? Because she's just brilliant. And that has pulled me more deeply into a quest to understand, for example, how we create a political culture online, and frankly, why people are being so nasty to each other, among other things. And so this leads me up to the present, where I'm editing a book with colleagues from Texas Tech that's specifically about divisive communication and various kinds of misinformation slash disinformation in West Texas. And I'm also working on a book specifically. It's a book that I have working with a great editor at St. Martin's that will be specifically about climate change and disinformation. So that's where I'm sorry for such a long-winded explanation, but it kind of helps to explain who I am and how I came to be doing research on this particular topic.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, Bryan. And no, yeah, I was just gonna say, so yeah, that's a great intro into who you are and why you got into this work. I guess probably where we should start is sort of like the baseline understanding of climate change, because what we hear a lot in the political rhetoric is, well, we've always had shifts in the Earth's temperature, which of course is true. But I'd like you to explain a little more about what's different now in this time frame versus what's happened in the past. Also, people say, "Oh, well, yeah, that's climate change. It's called summer, it's called autumn, or whatever, right?" Like they conflate the changing of the seasons with what we're talking about in terms of climate change. So could you give everybody just a baseline understanding of what even is climate change, all the basics, I guess, of that?
Sure. I mean, the thing to understand is that climate, is a trend, and that weather is a fleeting phenomenon. Like what we're having today in Lubbock, it's what the Irish call a soft day. I think that's a wonderful way to describe that drizzly weather that we're having, and potentially becoming freezing fog. But there's a difference between a trend and what is fleeting day to day, the weather phenomenon. And the classic illustration of this, and the thing that's really concerning, is that is the hockey stick that shows the rise of heat trapping gases over time to a point in our present moment, where we haven't seen these gases at this level in 250 million years. Not only that, but these levels are essentially alien to the time that humans have been on this planet. And of course, this is a worrying trend. I think a misunderstanding that runs with it is, uh, well, okay, we uh, we we go back to terms like global warming, but of course, Catherine underscores this idea of global weirding. You're going to have stranger weather events more often. You're going to have, weather-driven disaster events more often, and so that's not just the hot, the heat. Although we keep blowing through one record after another with the hottest recorded years on Earth, we've experienced another one. And this trend, there's every reason to believe, will continue based on the way that the atmosphere is loaded. We can say that we've loaded the atmospheric dice. But in terms of weirding, I think where the confusion sometimes lies, and then in a way, this can become the basis for a misinforming argument. But it's the kind of thing where someone will say, well, what about the big freeze that we had in Texas? That shows that the planet's not getting hotter. Well, actually, it is. One thing is a weather event. The heating of the planet is climate. It's long-term trends, and so that's why the language of global weirding, I think, is really useful. Um, having, say, 40 inches of rain deposited around Houston in a single weather event is pretty weird. And we can look at this in terms of the rising cost of disasters, especially over the past several decades. And we can also look at it in terms of, I like to ask people, well, what have you seen that's weird? You talk to older people, say ranchers in and around Lubbock, and they'll tell you, like, yeah, this is not how it was when I was growing up. That could be everything from changing humidity levels to the kinds of animals that we see around here. I love talking to older people about that. Now, that's not to lay everything at the feet of climate change. We've played a role in depleting the environments in which a lot of the flora and fauna that are endemic to the southern plains can live and thrive in. But climate is obviously playing a big role in that. And as Catherine would say, it's an everything issue. It tends to exacerbate a lot of the challenges that we already face. For example, the depletion of the Ogallala aquifer. But scope back from that, it's a leading human health concern globally, and there are many medical societies that recognize that. Our own military, our own government recognizes that it is a leading problem in terms of as a threat multiplier to national and global security, because it's leading to human migrations and all kinds of climate related issues, everything from crop failure, all these things can actually foster conflict in various ways around the world. So it is an everything issue. And that makes it difficult when we talk about it, because we want to sort of either say, well, it's something over there, something for the future. It's something that environmentalists need to worry about. But I think it's something that we all have to find a way to engage thoughtfully with. Um,
Yeah,
and,
it's
and we're
it's
all
such
implicated in. Mhm.
yeah, no, it's such a loaded question we ask you because we're like, give us a sort of baseline on, what is climate change? And as you say, it's like, I mean, you could drill down 100 hours on just kind of like starting to wrap your head around this sort of issue. And like, like you say, this has always been a part of our globe, but now largely because of human activity, we've kind of exacerbated and like thrown fuel on that fire. And also, it is a particular problem, and this is where this intersects greatly with Lubbock Compact and our work, is that we have a built environment that we have constructed based on what we understand about climate in a given area, and so Lubbock, for instance, we've built infrastructure to deliver reliable drinking water here for what we believe is 100 years. But actually, this a changing climate situation could throw that into question and make us have either less water than we think we have for 100 years, or it could mean we're actually dealing with a great deal more water than we anticipated needing to deal with. And both of those are a problem for humans in the built environment, because what are we going to run out? Is the tap not going to turn on? Or are we going to have homes in areas underwater? And so this is a particular problem for like civilization, because everything that we construct, all of our norms are based on what we understand about what we can predictably, what we can rely on being predictable in this area. And now all of that is thrown into question. I also think it's really interesting how, you know, yes, this is a way for us to like kind of zoom in on sort of one thing, which is this like climate issue. And it's, of course, there's probably no more important human context sort of thing to be concerning ourselves with right now. But also, I think it's very interesting how it's this is kind of like a case study in how this type of information, misinformation, disinformation is used and utilized by often disingenuous actors to obscure the effects or weight decision-making processes in their own favor, or just call it what it is, like make a quick buck as fast as you can. So maybe you want to talk about that issue a little bit more, like what is with the um denialism, the misinformation, the rhetoric that surrounds this issue particularly, and a whole host of other issues like.
Yeah, well, I can give several examples. But first, I want to affirm the point that you just made, Josh. I mean, people in Lubbock understand that, this area, for example, if the dry line changes, it has a huge bearing on where and how we live. And it also makes it very difficult to plan for things. Similarly, Tornado Alley, that has seemingly been changing over time. And all these things are interrelated with climate change. But in terms of, as you said, disinformation, related to climate. There's a classic study of that by a woman named Naomi Oreskes called Merchants of Doubt. And this book was published, I want to say, it's almost, it may have been around 2010. But I had the pleasure of interviewing her at one point, brilliant scientist who wrote this expose of how essentially the industry, the oil and gas industry, used the same tactics as big tobacco to deliberately craft a disinformation campaign. In that instance, they created a body called the American Petroleum Institute, and it laid out a very clear agenda. You know, it's not an easy thing to read because it is one of those things that, you know, it comes out of a smoke-filled room. You're like, I can't believe that people schemed this up so deliberately. It's where the title of her book comes from, because in a sense, doubt is the product. And so, you know, the same thing happened in the 1950s. There was a kind of crisis for tobacco where it was just becoming undeniable that indeed it was causing cancer. There were a lot of health harms. And so the industry created essentially a disinformation campaign to obscure that fact, but it was based in raising doubts. In, for example, having, buying experts, quote unquote, who might be willing to say, well, the science is uncertain. And so we have seen the same thing with climate change. In fact, we forget very quickly that in the 80s, for example, and going into the 90s, there was this kind of golden hour where there was a lot of bipartisan consensus around the issue. That, yeah, it's like the ozone hole. Like, we can't run away from this, and it's something we need to work together to fix. And unfortunately, that was a crucial moment where a really full-fledged disinformation campaign got underway. I can even show you, for example, in the playbook, so to speak, the American Petroleum Institute, ginned up by the industry to sow doubt, said, well, look, we want people to believe that there are two sides to this. And that's why when it comes to climate denialism, which persists, unfortunately, in spite of like 99.6 to 99.9% scientific consensus, overwhelming scientific consensus, it is partly a product of this effort, this campaign, to get people to think, well, there must be two sides to this. And the two sides thinking is a problem in a lot of disinformation driven dialogue that we have. And I think that includes our political dialogue, because it's an effort to sow doubt and to make people think that there are two legitimate sides to the issue. Where science is concerned, whether it is the United Nations, whether it's our own national climate reports, there is no question. There's only one side, and that is we are seeing human-driven climate change on an enormous scale. And the other piece of that is that we have the metaphor that Catherine always uses is we've loaded the bathtub. The bathtub is full, like it's spilled over. And so we have the dual challenge of stopping our emissions that contribute to the phenomenon, turning off the tap, but also figuring out if there's any way to make the drain bigger and to draw it down. What we're seeing now, and I do mean now, the big news today coming out of what's called COP28, which is the international conference of parties meeting, the big climate change meetup where we hope that treaties are negotiated and that we're able to address the problem in a global way. The debate or the dialogue has largely been driven by the position that we should stop using fossil fuels, or whether they should merely be, we should merely taper our use of fossil fuels. And it was revealed that, for example, the McKinsey Consulting Corporation was hired to help create a new frame for the dialogue. And that's where we get into the realm of disinformation. And I've been writing about specific positions and arguments coming out of the conference that I think are kind of deceptive by nature. Because the fact is, we actually have to stop using these fuels as quickly as we possibly can. What happens then in, I think, a dialogue that is designed to misinform people is you give them false choices. You say, well, that's going to send us back to the caves. But nobody's really proposing that we just stop tomorrow. But to your earlier point, Josh, we live in a world that came out of the post-World War II petrochemical revolution that, on one hand, helped stop global famine, and which gave us these amazing conveniences that we enjoy today, including our ability to travel, to have pharmaceuticals, to live in the way that we do. The flip side of that is it created a series of delicate dependencies that we're very reliant on. And when you start to talk about how do we change that or rethink it, understandably, that's change. It makes people nervous. So it's a problem that's so thorny that what's called solution aversion becomes a problem. In the same way that some of us might like to stick our heads in the sand and not think about the possibility of all the tumult and hardship that climate change can cause. We even find it hard to think about the solutions, particularly if we're afraid that those solutions will be effortful or require us to change in some respect. So that's another reason, in fairness to everyone, why this is a hard thing to talk about. However, as Flannery O'Connor would say, I think the truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it. And Catherine urges in her book, and we talk a lot about this, that one of the most important things we can do is talk about it and really bring it into our conversations so that we can have a better understanding of where those anxieties are. And then also our common ground, how we can see what other people care about and use that as the come from place to actually try to solve some of these problems. Because it turns out that on the level of solutions, a lot of them are things that are really good for us and that actually enhance our lives rather than take something away from us. Now, I don't think that the industry, necessarily wants people to think about it that way. And to the extent that they do, a lot of times that rhetoric is just kicking the can down the road. It was said at the conference, well, we have to kind of deal with the hand that we have while we build the system that we want. And there's a real problem with the endless temporizing, like we're going to fix this next year, or we're going to talk about this next year, even as the planet continues to warm. And even as people are really suffering these harms, especially the poorest people in the world. And this pertains even in our own country, and we can talk about that in terms of environmental justice. These are the communities where those impacts are sharpest. For example, if you're living in a low income area in a flood prone area in coastal Texas, um, this is coming straight to your door. But it might come to your door in the panhandle with an out of control fire or drought or fill in the blank. So we're all seeing it, but still, these are disproportionate impacts in certain communities.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
all good information, Brian. We do have some comments, and I think it's a good point to bring this up in the conversation. So Stacy says, and this was something that I was thinking about. She just happened to say it before I got a chance to. So when we were growing up in school, this was not such a controversial topic, and I remember specifically, I was at Roosevelt Middle School here in Lubbock, Texas, way east of Lubbock, Texas. Actually, it's actually outside the city limits. And we were in junior high, and I remember in our science class there being a whole exercise about what we should do to take care of the planet. And it was like, it was given to us as students to work in groups and come up with ideas about how we could protect our planet because we only have one. And, no matter who you are, this affects you, right? And I just think about today. If I was in the Roosevelt Middle School of today, would that happen? Because today what we hear, or what we would hear, I feel like, from a lot of parents or others, is that, oh, you're pushing this woke ideology, right? Like, this is radical woke whatever, right? Ideology. And so you know, it wasn't that controversial. Stacy says she's curious as to how this is handled in public schools now. Stacy, in the middle school that I work in now, I hear nothing about the environment. I hear nothing about climate change. This is not what the students are being asked to work on, as far as I can tell. So I guess, Brian, where I'm going with this is, like, how did we get here? What does this disinformation look like in practice? I know you've gone a little bit into this, as far
Yeah,
as these groups that were created, you know, and then I guess you could go into maybe how we can start to combat this. I don't know, but how did we
sure.
get here? How did we go from that point in time, just, not even that long ago? I was, what, 14, 15 years old, to now I'm 42 years old, and it's this whole thing. Like, what happened?
I hear you. And we also can step back from this and look at our political culture in general. Um, People use the word partisanship. Um, I think a lot of Americans are wondering, why are we at each other's throats this way? How did these things become so charged? And actually, Adam, I think it's even worse than that in the schools, because there is a movement in the legislature, and Christy knows, my wife knows more about this than I do, to actually make sure that you can't talk about climate, for example, in Texas textbooks, which is really astonishing to me. And it,
It
it
is.
makes me,
Let me interrupt you. It's so astonishing because actually conservation started with conservative people. Conservationism was a conservative idea that in its very heart has in it the word conserve, which
yeah.
was a movement by conservative folks to not take America's most important national treasure, which is our wild lands and our unsettled spaces, and conserve that. That was a conservative idea. Anyway, go on.
No, that's a great point, Josh. And
It's
yeah,
bonkers.
and I mean, the concepts like being a fiscal conservative means you're stewarding your financial resources carefully. And I think that's something that most Americans admire and agree on. So yeah, in order to get to these places, and particularly, I'm going to take us into, closer to our own time, like the past 20 years. Um, I don't think it's an accident that we're talking about a nation that steps into the digital age. And there are a lot of untested technologies that, in some cases, are designed to motivate and persuade and change behavior. And so, one of the ways you get to an impasse like that is through a lot of small nudges. So let me try this. I'm going to share my screen and give an illustration, because this is a case where I think a picture really is worth 1,000 words. Give me 1 second to get my mouse over here. Okay, here we go. Um, so, and just for the benefit of listeners, I will say, like, I'm interested in disinformation. Um, some of my colleagues refer to this more broadly, like disinformation, misinformation. We can think about divisive communications, any message that's designed to divide and polarize people. And I think that is useful terminology. But the reason I'm interested in disinformation, I always tell my students, it's easy to remember because you're dissing people. You are dissing them when you deploy disinformation, because you are introducing deliberately harmful information. It's designed to mislead. So in the slide that I've put up here that hopefully you can see, this comes from a kind of internet observatory experiment. And what this illustrates is what was happening around the time of the Black Lives Matter kind of national dialogue. A scholar named Kate Starbird at the University of Washington was really just observing. They said, let's kind of capture what's happening here. What are people talking about? And so what you have there is a scatter plot of left-leaning positions and right-leaning positions on Black Lives Matter. And, they started to see this weird thing happening, right? Where the nodes of the conversation were in one place, but then they really started to kind of dilate and spread out. And if you look at those orange swaths in the middle, this is disinformation metastasizing. These scholars were like, what's going on? Why are people like getting more and more divided, more polarized about this? It turns out that the IRA, the same troll farms that interfered with the 2016 elections, as was documented by our own investigations and lawmakers, it turns out that there was a troll node in each side of this dialogue. And the way it works is you nudge, 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 nudge. you make people's positions become more extreme. You appeal to their sense of outrage and often powerlessness. Fun fact about this one in particular, both the left-leaning and right-leaning nodes had a common thread of a dislike of Hillary Clinton. They found that they could amp up that dialogue and wrap other political messaging around it. So this sort of thing, it's not just something that like, oh, okay, maybe the Russians or some hostile foreign power is involved in this. Of course, many people are unwittingly involved in this. When we get to solutions, one of the things I do with my students when I teach them about disinformation is I just trick them relentlessly. They come into the class as these swaggering digital natives. They're like, well, you can't fool me. I can spot fake news. I can spot a fake account. I can spot synthetic media. And then I say, look, I'm going to fool all of you within 3 tries. It's like doing magic tricks. And inevitably, they're quite surprised to find how easily deceived they are. And so I always talk about radical humility. We all need to be aware that we are going to be manipulated. We have what's called motivated reasoning. We're going to see what we like to see. But that awareness can be a really important starting place. And so if I might just share one or two more of these. I will say, as someone who does this research, unfortunately, the research itself is becoming politicized. I have colleagues being pulled out to testify about this, which is worrisome. My own term for this sphere that we live in is the disinfo sphere. But the last thing I'll say about this in terms of bringing it back to Lubbock, one of the things that I'm interested in is what's called pink slime journalism. And we had some pretty dramatic examples of this right in our own community. Pink slime journalism is essentially, it comes from the same term as that gross stuff that is all the fake ingredients mashed up that go into, say, a hot dog. It's like news with a fake wrapper that's designed to appear like local news. But
Right.
in fact, it's usually designed to spread disinformation. This is just from last year about pink slime networks, where these local newspapers, quote unquote, pop up. And many of them, in fact, are backed by oil and gas interests. So if we go back to 2010 and Naomi Oreskes and Merchants of Doubt, that's kind of like one phase of the disinformation campaign. But now we're seeing a lot more of this in this area. And obviously, I don't want to go through all of these slides, but I'll end on this one because this was an example from our community. The Caprock Patriot was the name of this free newspaper that you could get at Market Street for some time. As we came up to January 6th, this paper, quote unquote, this local paper was, among other things, it was running sort of like QAnon stuff. It was urging its readers to go to the Capitol to overturn the election results. And this particular paper was working very closely with the Oil and Gas Workers Association in the Permian. One part of my research was like, well, where did this thing come from? Who was bankrolling it? I think a lot of our local advertisers didn't realize that this paper was espousing some very harmful positions. And some of them, I think, when they learned about this, withdrew. And the publisher eventually wrote this sort of valedictorian, self-pitying, I'm out of here. My advertisers pulled out. But I think to the credit of people in Lubbock, it's because a lot of them didn't want to buy what that was selling. So that's an example of pink slime journalism, which is one way to spread disinformation in a community, in part by playing on people's trust in local media. And
Yeah.
indeed, many of the interests that were driving this had a vested interest in certain results with respect to policy. I'm sorry, go ahead, Josh. Yep.
No. I mean, I just to summarize, that it's like, for me, this is some of the this is the oldest hucksterism in the book. You take this game has been played so many times, so many different ways. This is a new iteration of it, and also, as you point out, with the rise of social media, of all the various media apparatus, we really see it amplified. But the basic mechanics are: you put somebody or somebodies in a vulnerable position. Maybe their vulnerability is they don't have access to the information they need to make an informed decision. They don't have kind of like that baseline. Or maybe they are economically disenfranchised in some way. Maybe they're from a small town that doesn't have a lot of economic opportunity for them. or maybe they are vulnerable because of some very real, like, safe, maybe they live in a town that has a really high, violence incidents and really high gang violence or whatever. So you put people in a vulnerable state, or you don't address that circumstantially, things have stacked up to a vulnerable state for them. And once they're in that state, then they can be receptive to disinformation narratives that motivate them towards your position. And so, in the case of like fossil fuel companies, it's like, well, everybody's in this vulnerable state because we're very dependent on that right now. And it touches on our personal lives in this way that's very tangible. And so it makes it easy to manipulate a general public when uh, oil rich nations, oil companies, these types of folks and these types of entities will always have the resources to get out of the way of the disasters that they create. They will always be able to fly to a mansion somewhere else. They will always be able to pay for air conditioning. And they they won't jeopardize that access and resource for themselves. And so it is in their interest to make sure that the larger public is in agreement with their position. Or it could be any other thing. It doesn't have to be this thing. But either way, all you need are people in sort of a vulnerable state. And then they are receptive to this kind of manipulation, And so I love your notion about radical. What was it? Radical.
Radical humility. Yeah.
Yeah, radical
Yeah.
humility. I think that's really important for people to understand, because many of these situations are very complex, of course. And so we could all stand to, like, both learn and also be disarmed with other people's reasonable anxiety, so that we have a way to work around that, so that we have a way to get to solutions, so that we have a way to get people access to the information and then be receptive to it, and feel like there's trust there. um I don't know. I wasn't really going anywhere from there.
Yeah, no,
I thought it
this
was
is yeah,
summarize
no,
encapsulate.
that's
Adam?
no, that's great, Josh. Because the only thing that I would add, and we've talked about this in various contexts here on the show, but sometimes as nations, as whatever, we can have the wrong idea, right? And we can operate from that wrong idea for a very, very long time, for generations sometimes. The example that I like to use a lot is slavery. At one time in this country, we felt like slavery, not me, we as a country, as a developing country, thought that that was okay. We thought that, well, I don't want to go work those fields. So how are we gonna produce these crops at a low enough price so that I can make the maximum profit, right? And we operated from that and made ourselves think that it was okay collectively for a very long time, right? We had the wrong idea, point blank period. We had the wrong idea. It is not the right idea ever, no matter what the context is, to enslave another human being, right? Likewise, like Josh said, we've been so dependent on fossil fuels for so many aspects, even in our electricity generation, right? We talk about electric power. Even in generating that electricity, we use tons of gas, and depending on where you're at, it may be coal, right? These very finite resources that just aren't the best thing to use. The thing that makes it even more muddy sometimes is in terms of gas, whereas it has caused us to have lots of progress. It's caused us to have lots of prosperity in some instances. It's made things easier and all of these different things. And so it's very hard to change doing a thing when we're that wrapped up in it, when it's done that much for our situation, and where it props up so much of our situation. So, given that we have this whole knot, if you will, how I mean, I'm hoping that you can give us some answers on this because I'm not quite sure in our current political climate. I think that some people, unfortunately, you can't have a rational conversation with. I think a lot of people are so bought into wherever they are on the spectrum that they're just not going to budge from that. But I do feel like there's a large part of the population where they will listen to reason, or they can take in some different information and maybe process that. So how do we have these conversations? How do we combat this? How do we go about untangling this huge knot? Bryan, I hope I didn't put a whole
How
a
much
whole
time do we
thing.
have left? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I just threw a
Well,
boulder on you real quick and asked you to crawl out. So
well, let's give people some credit. In fact, for all of the sort of perception that we're far apart on these issues, the reality is that we're not as far apart as we think when you actually look
Hmm.
at, as you said, Adam, people who want to address these problems. For pure denialists, Catherine talks a lot about this. They're a write-off. They're not going to be moved or persuaded, and they may have very intense personal reasons for that. That maybe we can find some compassion for, and maybe it does come from a place of vulnerability, as you suggest, Josh. But as with any change campaign, and this will resonate with people who do business, if you have to initiate a change campaign, 10% of people will never sign on. It doesn't matter what you do. So a lot of it is about good communication and a real willingness to hear people and their concerns. You mentioned, for example, gas, natural gas. I worked with a delightful colleague on a climate simulation uh, project, and he was just a citizen volunteer who had been involved in the energy industry his entire life, really, and worked extensively in Texas. And he had such great pride at one point because they installed scrubbers and they were switching to natural gas. And they didn't realize that the harmless carbon dioxide, the byproduct, was in fact a kind of pollutant because it was a heat trapping gas. We thought we had solved that problem. Here again, radical humility. People trying to make a living, doing what they can, and that's understandable. But when we get into our divisions, I could talk about solutions more broadly for contending with disinformation. But in terms of contending with the problems in front of us, the good news is that, for example, Texas now a leading state in solar production. Certainly, we are in like the biggest wind producing energy region in the state. There are all kinds of jobs that will come along with this, right? And so when we talk about a transition from fuels, there is world enough in time for people to be a part of that transition in a positive way. And there are great health benefits. You mentioned coal. It's a kind of bitter irony to me that here in Lubbock, for the longest time, LPNL just didn't have much renewable energy in its mix. So who is buying the wind energy that we produce here? A lot of it is moving with a lot of energy loss along the way to other markets where people want to buy green energy. So I'm actually very excited about the ERCOT connection and being able now to buy exclusively green energy, including energy that's made right here, in our locality. So I think that's a really great thing. We knew 25 years ago, for example, that truly on cost benefit analysis, coal was killing people, not worth the cost of the energy source in terms of the human harms. Why didn't we get rid of it? Well, disinformation campaigns played a big role in that, and industry politics and lobbying. I would say, secondly, that a lot of frustration and the partisanship that we see comes from the underlying fact. And this, I've got a real simple illustration I use in my class. What was the middle class? What did it look like in 1970? What does it look like now? And you can tell people all they want. The economy is getting better. And on some numbers, absolutely it is. But people's ability to advance and better their own lives and to live the so-called American dream is way expensively out of reach for most people now. And they are lucky. They know they're working harder than ever just to stay, if they're lucky, in the middle class. Forget about class mobility. I mean, so I think that frustration drives a lot of this. I will say too, I mean, this is important to say, especially as we approach another election cycle. In 2016, there was disinformation, interference, and manipulation of social media, as documented by our own investigations and our own lawmakers. There's bipartisan consensus we should do something about that. I could tell you the harrowing stories that pull me more deeply into this topic as I watched in 2020, as not only did we do the same things, but we started to see them get worse. Add to this AI and the ability to algorithmically amplify and even synthesize disinformation campaigns. We actually now are able to document how some of the debates, just like I showed you with Black Lives Matter, how they were juiced up around COVID and public health. And I can tell you, even the so-called Texit movement, the purported 200,000 would-be Texas secessionists who think that Texas should leave the Union. Well, to your point, Adam, like I think that was tried around 1860. It didn't go so well for the nation. But more to the point, people need to know that, and one of my colleagues is writing about this using publicly available information, that this is another area where the Russian trolls have actually amplified the messaging. So another thing people don't want, and I'll leave you with this thought, when it comes to disinformation, nobody wants to be a fool or played for a fool. The Russian phrase from long ago used by propagandists is the useful idiot. We don't want to be useful idiots. And so what I demonstrate to my students, and which I mentioned earlier, is when you show people how easily we are fooled, that doesn't mean, one, okay, it creates what's called an inoculation response. Same as a vaccine. You know, your body will be more on alert the next time it's exposed to the harmful thing. It's the same concept. This is psychology that's been around since the 1950s. But another thing that we know works is that no one wants to be played for a fool, right? And so I think we can go forward with radical humility. We also have to address our culture, which has become, and I think this is partly an online phenomenon, more about calling out than calling in. And I even think this goes all the way back to the Puritan roots of the country. It's the gotcha game where it's like, ha, you're a hypocrite, or you did this thing that's wrong. So whatever you say is invalid. And that gets us nowhere. We're spending this time at each other's throats at a time when our nation's very vulnerable. Many of us are economically and environmentally vulnerable. And the world is on fire in terms of climate change. We don't have time. And Josh, you said earlier, like, where does this come from? There have always been interests that are able to go about accruing political and economic power by pitting us against each other. It's a very cynical play, but as you said, Josh, this has been with us since the beginning of our history. We see that in the politics of race, which goes back to slavery, and we keep fighting each other instead of pulling together. So nobody wants to be played a fool that way. And I think actually we have a lot of common ground there. It's very hard once someone becomes radicalized, like you said. Think of people that here in Lubbock who have lost family members to the QAnon phenomenon or to various types of radicalized politics. We have a duty to be mindful of our civic and media education and to look honestly. We can't shy away from teaching about these things at any level of education, because it's only we're harming ourselves in that. And again, the facts don't go away just because we don't want to look at them or because it brings us into the realm of difficult conversations. So I don't have, in all radical humility, I don't have magical solutions. No one does. But I think we're going to need a lot of creativity and a willingness, each of us, this is like compromise writ large, to step back from the brink and away from vitriolic, divisive communications and to do the kind of good listening that you guys are talking about. When it comes to climate change, you find a place of common concern. You talk to your uncle, the conservationist at Christmas dinner, and you say, "What was your hunting season like?" And he says, "Man, it was hot. The deer weren't there. Like, it's just weird." And you're like, "Yeah, I feel that. I'm wondering what's going on with our climate." Maybe even though you don't agree with him politically in other ways, you actually have a place of common concern, and you can start from there. So anyhow, we've all got to work on this together. I wish I had better answers. I don't want to just admire the problem, but we are working on those. And I think people are becoming more and more aware that this is a widespread social problem. It's making it very hard for us to get anything done. We look like the people that we send to Washington sometimes when all we do is fight and
Yeah.
shout.
Yeah. And
And so
this
maybe
this
we could
is
step back from that.
yeah, this is something that we talk about all the time, and I'll continue to talk about it. Open communication, even when the conversation is difficult, is the way forward. Because if we stick our head in the sand about things, that helps no one. That helps no one at all. We are dealing with some real life things as a city, as a state, and as a country. And if if we're not focused on those and trying to come up with real solutions, we're all in trouble. And no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, no matter who you want to vote for in 2024, it's none of it's going to matter if the planet just kills us all. And one thing I've said for a long time about planet Earth, I've read a lot about history, and probably more than probably more than I should, I guess. But I've read a lot about history of not only human beings, but of the Earth itself. And one thing that I can glean from that information about the history of the Earth itself is that the Earth itself will remain. It will continue to grow. The trees will continue to grow, the grass will continue to grow, and if it needs to, it will get rid of humans and continue to grow. The earth is not going to go anywhere. We can definitely go somewhere. And we as at least as of now, because the billionaires haven't figured out how to get us to the next planet yet and how to cultivate that. As of right now, we only have one. And again, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, no matter what your interests or disinterests are, this is it, folks. This is all we got. And like you said, I'm sure there's people who are, vehemently online talking all this trash about solar and woke energy and all this kind of stuff that, like you said, are going on their hunting trips that they take every year. And they're like, something is off. Those are the things that are indicators. And I think that the adult thing to do for all of us adults that are alive right now is to put a lot of those disagreements aside and start dealing with some of these real life things and start trying to understand because nobody is arguing. If you're in the gas industry, or if that's what you've done your whole life, or if that's your business and you've had it for generations, nobody's arguing that you should just not have a livelihood at all anymore and that you should just go away. Nobody is arguing that. What we're trying to warn about, what we're trying to bring to the forefront is that it doesn't matter what you do for money. If we don't figure this stuff out, nobody's going to have anything. And so it really behooves us on all sides to work together to say, okay, if I'm a oil industry tycoon, I have to take a real life look at what's coming down the road. If I know that my business is problematic and that it may not be here, I need to figure something out for myself, for my employees, for my family. And so you have just as much interest in not denying this stuff and not sticking your head in the sand as anybody who's not in the oil and gas industry. And so I think that maybe, hopefully, we can get some folks to understand that on all sides enough to where we can move this forward. Because, like you said, Bryan, nothing's going to happen with us arguing back and forth and then everybody closing their doors and then that's it. It's just not going to happen. And so that's my spiel for the day, my soapbox for the day. Josh, do you have anything to add? We're a few minutes over before we go
Yeah,
out.
no, I mean, I just think that Bryan has shared with us. I mean, it is such a I think that the two takeaways here are the calling others into the work, because it is, we have so many complex, difficult problems before us, but they are solvable problems. And every single thing that humans have ever done can also be changed and undone. None of it is so permanent. And so we want everybody at the table. We want their contribution to the work before us. And so I think like calling them into it is a great way to put that. And I also would thank you for giving us all some ways that we can reflect on the change that needs to happen in self, so that we can facilitate that work that happens outside of self. And I think that's a really a good thing that you brought to the table, and I'm glad you did. I hope everybody will take that away from this conversation. Bryan, are there final thoughts for you to leave our audience with, Bryan?
I'm just, again, really grateful to have some time to talk with you about this. And I should apologize for talking too much. But I think my closing thought is just, again, to affirm what you said, Adam. Maybe it's worth all of us reflecting on the fact that at a moment when it seems our politics have gotten uglier than ever, and at a moment when we're treating each other so poorly, look at the state of the planet in that same moment. You can draw your own conclusions about whether these phenomena are related or not. I happen to think that they are, and that there is a reflectivity. The way that we treat each other really matters. And if you take the long view, and we think about traditional knowledge, we think about indigenous practices, we have to figure out a way to be in harmony with each other and the environments that we live in. That is the only way to persist. And like you said, Adam, the earth is neutral about it, in the sense that whether we're here or not, this is on us to figure out. And it could be the most glorious test of our humanity ever. Because I think if we can get through a very perilous moment, we're going to see some really wonderful things potentially. And these could come with a transition to energy sources that improve our health, improve our ways of relating to each other. But it's going to require a lot of ingenuity, and it will require some change. So we can maybe embrace that instead of just being terrified of it. We might even come out better on the other side. So anyhow, thanks again, guys. This fantastic conversation. I so appreciate it.
Thanks,
No, I
Bryan.
agree.
Perfect way
And
to end us
that's a
off. Yeah,
perfect
go
place
ahead,
to
Josh.
leave. No, no, Jinx. Go ahead, Adam.
All right. Well, we'll be right here next week for our final show of the year. So I hope you will join us. And thanks, Bryan. Thanks, everybody who tuned in. Please share this video far and wide. Start the conversations. And hopefully we can come up with some solutions for us all, because that's what it's really all about. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.